Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome all of you to the LSE for this evening's event. My name is Elaine Fox, and I'm Professor of Experimental Psychology at the University of Oxford, and I'm Director of the Oxford Centre for Emotions and Affective Neuroscience. And one of the things we're really interested in that centre, the Ocean Lab, is happiness. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here to listen to Professor Paul Dolan this evening talking to us about happiness. Professor Paul Dolan will define happiness in terms of experiences of pleasure and purpose. He will describe how being happier...
Stop it. You don't want to be giving it all away.
Oh, sorry, right? I won't give all of it away, don't worry. He'll describe how being happier means allocating our attention more efficiently towards the things that bring us pleasure and purpose, and away from the things that generate pain and pointlessness. Behavioural sciences tells us that most of what we do is not so much thought about, rather it simply comes about. So by clever use of priming, I hear some of you may have heard this before, I think. So by clever use of priming, which I'm doing right now, defaults, commitments and social norms, you too can become a lot happier without having actually to try to think very hard about it. You'll be happier by design. Paul is a professor of behavioural neuroscience in the Department of Social Policy, and he's the author of Happiness by Design, Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life. So just before we begin, for those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSE Happiness. So if any of you are tweeting, that's the hashtag you can use. I'd ask you at this point to please put your phones on silent so as not to disrupt the event. The evening's event is being recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast, subject to no technical difficulties. As usual, after the lecture, there'll be a chance for you to put your questions to Paul. There'll also be a book signing taking place following the event, and copies of Happiness by Design will be on sale in the foyer area, and Paul will be available for book signing in the Old Theatre. But now, would you please join me in welcoming Paul Dolan to the LSE to deliver his lecture, Happiness by Design. Thanks, Paul.
Cool. Wow, thank you so much. Am I on? Can you hear me all right there at the back? Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, it's nice to give a talk on home soil. I feel quite nervous, actually. So I should say a few thank yous at the start. It's not like an Oscar ceremony or anything where I'm going to start gushing and crying. But I've obviously want to thank my agent for getting me a fantastic book deal, Penguin for doing a fantastic book. I love the cover, by the way. I've always said that. That actually isn't true. I said that I didn't like it to begin with. Where's the next? Have we got the next? I need to press something to get the next slide up. Do I? Do I press something? Okay, I'll just leave it at that. Anyway, you can see the book. There's loads of people that I've worked with, and I can see many of them here, so I'm not going to thank them all now. They know who they are. I will thank Laura Kudrina, though, who last summer worked almost as hard as I did, finishing the book with me, and most of the academic insights are hers. No, actually, no. She went and found out things that I was making up, basically, and some things that were true. So things have been actually going really well so far, and there's been quite a few sales. But of course, you can't please all the people all of the time. And I'd just like to read you a couple of words from an Amazon review. It's a great place to look at what people think of you and your work. There you go. Don't worry.
You talking?
Yeah, you're just making things worse. Leave it. So, but thanks for trying. My only lesson from reading this book is that once renowned universities, I guess that means the LSE, once seats of academic excellence, have slumped to the lowest common denominator. I guess that's me. Who would have seriously imagined a professor of happiness 30 years ago? Well, there you go. Well, let's cast our minds back 30 years, for those of us old enough. There was a miners' strike. There were IRA bombs going off on mainland Britain. The Smiths released Heaven Knows I'm Miserable Now. And less significantly, Sir John Stone received the Nobel Prize in Economics for developing an accounting model that could be used to track economic activities. So, Dr. Stephen Lee, you're absolutely right. 30 years ago, it would have been unimaginable. to have a professor of happiness, especially at the LSE. Fast forward 27 years to 3 years ago, and I gave my inaugural lecture here at the LSE in the Sheikh Zayed in February 2011. And after that talk, someone said to me, "You should write a book about that." I thought, well, yeah, maybe Kahneman can do it. It's written this Thinking Fast and Slow or something. I just heard of it. And I thought, yeah, well, okay. I'll try and see if I can gather up some of these insights into a book. And that's what I did. So 3 years on, here we are. Thanks again for coming. And let me tell you a little bit about the book. So, well, actually, you've been told everything about the book anyway from the intro. The first thing that I think it's important to do is to be clear about what happiness is. And because, of course, the term is used quite widely, and different things are used. Subjective well-being is a term that's favoured in the academic literature. Perhaps it makes it feel a bit more serious. Misery and suffering are actually really quite useful terms to use for policy making, by the way. If you, as someone who's spent a lot of time around Whitehall and elsewhere, if you try to sell happiness measures as happiness measures, sometimes people look at you as if they're a little bit trivial and silly. But if you try to reduce suffering, who's not interested in that? You'd be a pretty sadistic person that wasn't interested in doing that. So language matters. But it's important that I think that we measure these things properly. And as many of you will know, most of how we... So I'm just checking I've got my flies down. Most of... I thought I could do that subtly, but I thought I'd just probably share that with you. Most of what we think we know about happiness comes from asking people global questions of the kind, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? And it takes people, on average, about 3 seconds to answer that question. If you think about it, it's very fast. I'll save the swearing for later. It's very fast. And clearly isn't an answer to the question that's being asked. If you actually thought about overall how satisfied are you with life, it's a really difficult, cognitively demanding question to answer. Most people just think, well, maybe I'm about a 7, kind of, or an 8 maybe, if I'm feeling lucky. So importantly, though, I think those questions are the answers to those questions are largely constructions. Most of us don't routinely walk around thinking about how satisfied we are with our lives overall. We'll answer the question when it's asked of us. And actually, most of what goes into the answer is not an assessment of how we feel, but much more of an assessment of how we think we should answer the question given the circumstances of our life. So, I want to draw an important distinction between evaluations, and Kahneman does this towards the end of Thinking Fast and Slow, and experiences, which are much more directly located in how people feel moment to moment, day to day, as they engage in their activities. And I'm just going to give you a couple of stories that give you an insight into the distinction, I think, that's important. I'm going to just talk about 2 friends. These are real people. That's not, I've got more than 2 friends, but these are 2 friends. One of whom I went for dinner with, and she spent the whole of the evening complaining about her job, her boss, her commute. Everything about her experience was miserable. And then without any hint of irony, at the end of dinner, she said, of course, I love working where I work. Now, that's actually not such an odd thing to do. Because on the one hand, her experiences were telling her that her job was miserable. But the story that she told about her job was that it was a good one. She was working for a great company. It's somewhere that she'd always wanted to work. Other people were envious of her working there. How could she not be happy? So her evaluation of her work and her life was quite different to the experiences that she was having. Another friend, I'm not sure this is the best advert for the book, especially if I've got any married couples in the room, but this friend split up with her boyfriend of 7 years after reading the book. He was a great guy. Well, actually, I'm sure he is still a great guy. I'm sure he's absolutely lovely. Handsome and all those things. Great job and everything. But when she paid attention to the experiences, they weren't consistent with the story that was being told. And both of those people have now since changed jobs and partners and are happier as a result because they paid attention to the experiences, the feedback for how things were making them feel day to day, moment to moment, rather than the stories that we're told. And it's really interesting that these stories can be quite pervasive. And they start from a very early age. We have a 6-year-old daughter. We also have a 5-year-old son. But our daughter was saying, when we're going to see Grandad again, that's my wife's mum. Dad? Mum. Yeah, it's a strange family. I'm sure there's something Freudian in what I just said there. Elaine, maybe you can make a note of that. Grandad. And she said, when are we going to see him again? And my wife asked, why do you want to go and see him? Because he's quite ill and they don't have an especially good time when they go. And she said, because we haven't seen him for a while. So it's really interesting because we hadn't said that there's something about the story that we need to go and see him regularly. But it's obviously one that she's picked up from somewhere as something that we ought to do. Now, it's not to say that we ought not to do that, but it's not directly consistent with the experiences that the kids are having when they go and see him. So these stories are quite pervasive and very strong. So I think we should be paying much more attention to our experiences. But not just, and most of the experience measures that we talk about when we measure happiness are experiences of affective states, are emotions basically, joy, contentment on the one hand, and a lot more negative adjectives, worry, stress, anger, anxiety, and so on the other. And what I'm arguing in the book is that we should be considering another important category of experiences that are not just about pleasure, shorthand for pain and pleasure and all the things that we feel as emotions, but purpose. Experiences of things that we find fulfilling, worthwhile and meaningful, and the obverse futile and pointless, that sit alongside experiences of fun. And the argument is that happy lives are ones that contain a good balance, not in equal measure and not the same for everybody, but the right balance between experiences of pleasure on the one hand and purpose on the other. So a lot of our research is informed by our own personal experiences, and coming from the East End, I kind of grew up around a lot of experiences of pleasure, but very few people having, well, at least jobs that they found purposeful. And you come to a learned institution like the LSE or other places that I've worked before, and you see lots of people that have lots of purpose, but not very much pleasure. And so I think each of those lives could be made happier by a different combination of pleasure and purpose. So it's all right, by the way, for the LSE academics here to, have some fun once in a while. It won't kill you, and if it does, at least you died happy. So I will now just. I've got another little thing to say about Dr. Stephen Lee. This is the final quote I will read. This is one of the worst books I have ever read on any subject. The read offered me only pointless pain, but I battled through this awful book on happiness in order to write a review and warn others. Now, see, I think, Stephen, that actually you're wrong about that. I think writing that review gave you a lot of pleasure. And I can see a whole lot of purpose in that. He's having a bloody great time writing that, isn't he? Whoever he is, he probably knows me. He's bound to know me. Given that he's getting a lot of pleasure and purpose from that. He's actually living proof of the book without even knowing it. Actually, who writes a review anyway? Right? You've got to be a bit fucking weird, haven't you? Really? Right? I mean, there can only be purpose in doing that, right? You're warning others, you're doing all these things that give you experiences of purpose. That's what happy lives contain. Good. So you're a very happy man. So, I want to just finish on the purpose thing before then moving on to the second part of the first part of the book. I think experiences of purpose are critical to being happy overall. particularly at work. And I think we should be thinking much more about how within workplaces we can think about making activities that people engaging feel purposeful if they don't always feel like they're pleasurable. And particularly giving feedback. You know, a lot of people work in places where they start projects, they'll get terminated or cancelled for whatever reason, and there's no feedback that that's been worth it in any sense. So I think it's quite critical that we start to do that, and I'm hoping that measures of experiences of individual purpose will become important. I should just emphasise that it's experiences of purpose that I'm talking about. That's the contribution, not evaluations of how meaningful life is. I'm interested in the meaning of moments, not the meaning of life. The meaning of moments shows up when I'm listening to my kids read the same story for the 15th time, when I'm helping them tie their shoelaces, when I'm trying to teach them the times tables. That's where my experiences of purpose as a father show up, not when I evaluate my life and the story that I tell about how purposeful it is to be a father. That's a construction, it's a narrative, it's a story. I want to locate these experiences much more directly in people's experiences. Okay, let me then move on. I'm going to talk for another 5 minutes, is that about right? We've
Perfect, yeah.
Okay,
Perfect,
cool.
yeah.
So, I should have said at the outset that the book is essentially in two parts. There's a kind of academic contribution, if you like, in the first part, and then it's more prescriptive and self-helpy in the second part. It's obviously the self-help book to end all self-help books, and I'll explain why maybe later on. But the second part of the first part is to then consider, if we know now what happiness is and how we should be measuring it and thinking about experiences of pleasure and purpose, what determines it? And most research to date has essentially tried to relate inputs to outputs. Does money make people happy? Does being married? Does more sex? As if there's a direct association between that stimulus, the input, and the output of happiness. But anyone trained in Econ 101 or knows anything about companies knows that you don't just get land, labour, capital and all the inputs and suddenly widgets emerge. There's a production process that converts the inputs into the output. And my argument is that we do the same when we generate happiness. There's a production process that converts money, marriage and sex into the output of happiness. Well, what does that production process look like? What's the mechanism by which we produce output? Well, essentially, the answer is attention. It's what we pay attention to. So the answer to the question of whether more money, more marriage and more sex make you happy is answered by, well, it depends how much attention you pay them. Now, interestingly, pay attention, right? Now, that implies that it's a scarce resource, because if you pay attention to one thing, by definition, you're not paying attention to something else. So the short answer to being happiest of all is to allocate attention efficiently. And the short answer to why people aren't as happy as they might otherwise be is they make errors about where they will pay attention and the things that will continue to draw attention to themselves in the experiences of their lives. As Elaine alluded to, basically the last 2 decades of research in neuroscience, economics and psychology have taught us that most of what we do simply comes about rather than being thought about. We're driven by unconscious and automatic processes. You're making about 2,000 to 10,000 decisions every day. You're not thinking about most of those. They're automated processes, largely through habits. And so, again, in short, if you want to be happier, you're not going to get very far by thinking yourself so. This is why every single self-help book that you will ever read tells you to think differently. It will say, like, be positive. It's like, yeah, no shit, I kind of worked that bit out. How do I actually do that? And, of course, you don't know how to do that. It makes you more miserable when you buy another self-help book. The biggest single factor predicting the purchase of a self-help book is having bought a self-help book in the last 12 months. So, the US subtitle, by the way, for the book is quite... I spent a lot of time talking about finding pleasure and purpose in everyday life, which is the subtitle for the UK. The US subtitle is Change What You Do, Not How You Think. As it was about to go to press, the US editor said, Americans won't get that, it's too vague. They need to be directed, you know, what to do. So it's change what you do, not how you think. And so a lot of time in the second part of the book is spent thinking about how you can essentially organise your life in ways that make it easier for you to be happier without having to think too hard about it. It's really interesting that there's this kind of almost like this Protestant work ethic thing about most things, and also happiness, that you've got to work at it. It's got to be effortful. I have no idea why. If I can make being happier easier, or you can make being happier for yourselves easier, I'm up for that. See why I've got to work at it. What you need to work at is the design of your environments, of your situations, of your context, organising your life in ways that just make it easier for you to do things that you want to. The simple behavioural science insight, the very simple one, is if you want to do something, make it easier. And if you don't want to do something, make it harder. But you think about the number of things you do in your life, and policymakers too. We make it very easy for people to do things we don't want them to, and very hard for them to do the things that we do. So I could go on for a lot longer. I won't, because we're going to break this up into segments. I had it in my mind to finish around 7 o'clock. That's pretty much where I shall finish. That's the first part of the book covered. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. That is very interesting. Can you hear me all right? Is that, yeah? Okay, as Paul said, we thought one of the ways to do this would be to break it into segments. So we thought we could now have a little chat, maybe talk about some of the themes you've raised, and then we can throw it open to the audience at the end. So great talk and terrific book. I can highly recommend it. I really enjoyed reading it myself. We've obviously learnt, Paul, from your talk there, that this book can be genuinely life-changing. The experience of the couple, you said it obviously does can really change people's lives. So why then, I wonder, just in a more general question, why do you think a lot of people do consider happiness to be a bit trivial? It's something that psychologists or economists or behavioural scientists shouldn't really be talking about. I mean, why do you think there is this kind of sense that it's a bit of a trivial subject?
Oh, that wasn't one of the questions I sent you to ask.
No. I did say I'd throw in a few other ones.
No, you didn't have to start with one. You know. Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think that there's something pejorative about the use of the term subjective, right? I think that we've often thought that subjective means woolly and flaky and soft, and objective, on the other hand, that's hard and quantifiable and meaningful and tangible. And I think that's a mistake. I think if you know, anything that matters ultimately in someone's life shows up in how they feel. The other things matter too, but only as determinants of the final consequence.
Yeah.
You know, so we make lots of mistakes, and I didn't obviously have a chance to go into those too much just then. But who would actually really do something knowing for sure that it would make them feel worse? Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty masochistic. So, and I think over the last couple of decades, we've been able to, I think, get more sensible answers to questions that we pose people.
Right.
So we're now showing some associations between things that you would expect, and a few oddities too, that lend some credibility to the idea that people can give us something useful and meaningful when we ask them how they feel.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, I suppose it kind of related to that as well. There's another one you didn't give me. Ask me to ask you. A few new questions. I mean, we know from a lot of psychological research that actually people aren't very good at knowing what's going to make them miserable and what's going to make them happy.
No, they're not.
So, I mean, that's kind of interesting in itself. That people say, if I had more money, I'd be much happier. But actually, it turns out if they get more money, they're not particularly happier. So how do we then, so in terms of really kind of how do we improve our ability to figure out what is going to make us happier and what's going to make us miserable?
Yeah, I mean, that is a significant challenge, right? So I think the biggest hurdle, as I've thought more about the book since it's been finished, I do think that the biggest obstacle is this evaluation experience distinction. I think the stories that we tell about the things that we think should make us happy get in the way. And so more money will make me happy. That's a story. It's also based upon, though, an attentional bias and an error in forecasting impact. If you think about, in Thinking Fast and Slow, Danny Kahneman has the fortune cookie maxim, nothing in life is as important as you think it is whilst you're thinking about it. And if you think about a pay rise of more money, you're thinking it's going to make you happy, and it would if you spent all your time thinking about it. Mm-hmm. We're just not particularly good at being able to forecast which things continue to draw attention to themselves and which things don't. Most things we get used to quite quickly, right? There are, of course, some things, mental health problems, noise, random noise, not ticking clocks, that draw attention to themselves continually. And we're just not very good at being able to forecast those things.
Yeah. So how can we improve that then? I mean, is there... I mean, you do talk in the book about actions, like the focusing actions. So is that a kind of a way of...
Well, first of all, with the evaluation experience distinction, I think it's important to get feedback about how your job or your partner or everything else is actually making you feel day to day, moment to moment, rather than, carry on living in the stories about the things that you think should make you happy. So I think feedback's critical. But then, I think it's much more about then thinking about when you've identified the activities and the pursuits and the things that you enjoy and the ones that you don't, to be able to design environments that make doing those things easier and the things that you don't like harder, rather than spending a lot of time and effort trying to change the way you think about stuff, which doesn't drive most of what you do anyway.
Yeah. Great, yeah. Now, really interesting. I suppose then just going on to, I mean, a lot of the research we're doing as well, I've been reading a little bit of this research now, and it's kind of really interesting that we know that the kind of narrative, the stories we tell ourselves are quite critical. Sorry, is that when you just be near that? Sure. Obviously, the stories and the narrative are really important, and you kind of talk about that very nicely. And you also then talk about getting that balance between the kind of story we tell, and then the pleasure of the moments, or the kind of the moments. So how do we go about getting that balance right, do you think? Because obviously we know the narrative is important.
Yeah, between pleasure and purpose is a tricky thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be the thing. It's difficult because what I'm trying to do in the book is to provide a framework, not direct prescriptions about what people ought to do, and something that I might find fulfilling, you might find pointless. And so I don't think there's clearly not a one size fits all approach to what makes each of us happy. But I think there is something interesting, at least, in stepping back and thinking about how much of what you do you find pleasurable on the one hand, and how much of what you do you find purposeful on the other. And if you find things neither, then just stop doing them. Just stop doing them. Lost happiness is lost forever. That's a line that it takes a lot of people a while to understand, because you can't. It's not like money. You can't transfer it around a bank account and save for the future by being miserable now. If you're miserable now, you are really experiencing misery now. You don't get it back later on. But I think when you add purpose into the mix, I think you can find some activities that might otherwise just seem painful have a point to them. So I think if you're an athlete training for some event and you're up at 5 a.m. doing runs in the rain, that's painful, but there's probably purpose in that experience as well, purposeful in the experience. And so if there is purpose in the experience, it's arguably something that's worth carrying on with. But if there's neither pleasure nor purpose, then give it up.
Yeah.
Give it up.
Yeah.
And I think we're hard at giving things up. I mean, you should walk out of a cinema when you're watching a shit film. I mean, it's like, but you've paid the ticket price. You sit there in the hope that it's going to get better, and it doesn't. It's a waste of time. Get out.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Don't leave now, but giving people a license to walk away.
Well, if it's not too personal a question, can I ask you what makes you happy?
Oh God. Yeah, what makes me happy? I try and give these one-line answers. Working does, obviously. LSE is a brilliant place. Working out, that makes me happy. They both bring pleasure and purpose. Going out, that brings me largely pleasure and a bit of pain the following day. I guess those things: working out, and going out.
Okay,
I should mention my kids as well, I suppose, shouldn't I? Maybe a little bit of purpose once in a while, a lot of misery.
That's your narrative, yes.
It's a story. It is a big story, and it really is interesting when we say about how our children bring us, huge amounts of misery and a tiny bit of pleasure once in a while. Other parents look at you like that's something you shouldn't say, but they all know it and feel it.
Yes. I think that's probably true. Well, one of the things I was intrigued by in the book, you said that you always let other people choose your dinner for you in a restaurant. So why is that?
Yeah, I do. There's two reasons for that. One is attentional energy. I'd much rather be doing other things than looking at the menu. And, people know I just eat lots of protein, really. That's pretty much it. So as long as you get me chicken or something, it's fine. The other thing is that too much choice sometimes can, burden people and saddle people. So, oh God, have I made the right decision? Then you get envious of the meal that someone else has opposite you and wish you'd ordered that instead. Just give it all up. Just let someone else pick for you.
So is it easier if someone else picks? You find if they really get you something you really don't
yeah,
like?
As long as you trust them.
As long as you trust them, okay.
Yeah.
So it's
not eating some vegan, yeah, anyway, whatever.
And then what about weddings? You also mentioned you hate weddings and karaoke. I mean, it's, I would have thought you'd be the kind of guy who quite liked karaoke. Obviously not.
Can I leave now? Jesus. Karaoke, I mean, what the fuck? Like, someone murdering some rubbish song in the first place. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, this idea of organised pleasure kind of riles me a little bit. The idea that I'm told that I've got to be happy. Is a challenge, and also about expectations as well, right? So there was a study looked at the Millennium celebrations, I think, and people that had big parties planned and were looking forward to the night out had a much less fun on the night out than those that didn't have plans. And we know from most of our experiences, the best nights out have been ones that are not, that we just end up somewhere, ones that haven't been planned. And weddings, I mean, it's interesting in the paper recently, we've been spending a lot of time. I as someone who got married for £103.50, £60 of which was to prove who we were, I was utterly convinced that spending more on getting married made people less happy subsequently. And there are now data that absolutely support that view. So it's a waste of money.
Right, okay. Right. Fair enough. You can see how this book could be quite life-changing, I think. Just going back to some of the academic literature again, there's been a lot of research and a lot of interest in the public on mindfulness recently, and a lot of very good evidence that mindfulness can be very good at helping people to focus their attention on certain things rather than others. So you'd imagine, given what you're saying, I would have thought that would be actually quite a big issue for you, if it really does help us to focus our attention. But you don't really mention too much about mindfulness. Is that something you kind of deliberately didn't mention, or is it something you're...
Yeah, that is an interesting question. What do I think? Well, it is true that we are nearly always happier when we're paying attention to what we're doing and who we're doing it with. So when we're living in the moment. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what mindfulness training trains you to do. Yeah. Is to pay attention to your experiences. So in that sense, all of the recommendations about how you can design and organise your life in ways that make you happier are consistent with mindfulness. I just don't think you've got to go on a mindfulness course to do it. It comes to the effort thing. If I want to pay attention to what I'm doing and who I'm with, I turn my phone off so that I'm not distracted by text messages and emails. That helps me be mindful without me having to go through mindfulness training, because it's pretty effortful, and people select into that. A certain kind of person selects into it often, so I think we can be mindful in our environments, in our lives, without having necessarily to go through mindfulness training.
But you think, it's interesting though, isn't it? Because it is quite hard. I mean, most of us find that if you try and, say, focus on something for a certain period of time, it is quite difficult. Our minds tend to wander. Yeah. So do you think...
And I think I'd be crap at it as well. That's actually pretty much why. I mean, my attention would be distracted quite quickly. So I think I'd just be pretty rubbish at it. I think that's probably also one of the reasons why.
Okay. Well, I suppose that kind of leads on to another kind of issue I was thinking about. So a lot of the work I do, for example, is with people with depression and anxiety, and it's kind of similar in a way. You get a lot of people tell themselves very negative stories. The narrative is very negative. Often people don't take much pleasure, particularly in depression. A lot of the problem in depression is not so much feeling sad or feeling down, but actually just not being able to get pleasure in things. So do you think, a lot of this book did seem to me to be focused on people who are kind of pretty okay. It wasn't really aimed at people who are, say, depressed. But do you think people who might have those more mental health problems like depression would gain some help from your book? How can they design their world?
I think, it's tricky because I don't want to trivialise significant depressive problems, right? So if you're in a severe state, you probably don't go out to buy the book anyway, or even shop for it on Amazon. And clearly, and you should consult a specialist. I mean, that's obviously, there's no point saying anything else. But I think the more positive line is that whatever your level of happiness, including being depressed, is that you can be just a little bit happier by doing things that make you feel better. And most of those things actually are quite obvious. Spend time with people that you like being with. Go outside. help other people, listen to some music. These are all actually really quite obvious things. But they're obvious but overlooked. Because we all know, if you asked us what things made us happy, those 4 things would probably be on that list somewhere. But why don't we do more of them then?
Yeah,
it's because we're not organising our lives in ways that make it easier for us to. And so anyone can do that. I think.
Yeah.
Almost anyone.
I think it is. I totally agree that it is fascinating that, as you say, you know, it's not. A lot of the stuff is kind of pretty obvious, but actually, people don't get it really. So it's kind of all of us, you know. And I think it is kind of interesting. So do you think then, kind of just, you know, really reminding yourself all the time, like what really makes me happy, what really doesn't make me happy?
Yeah, I mean, it's always like in everything in life, it's finding the balance, and you want to pay attention to the feedback that you get about your happiness. Of course, I've said that, but you don't want to monitor it all the time. So in one study where people listened to music and they were asked to be happy whilst they were doing it, they were less happy than those that just listened to the music. So you don't want to pay attention to the consequence. You want to pay attention to the activities that bring that consequence. And so, you know, a bit of light touch monitoring, you know, once in a while is probably what you should do, rather than constantly asking yourself the question, is this making me happy? Because it's probably not if you keep asking yourself the question.
So do you think, given that then, is it worth kind of, you know, relying more on what other people who know as well say? So rather than relying on our own kind of subjective judgment, saying, well, your partner or friends, whatever, if they say, well, these things make you happy, these things don't, is that something we should do a bit more of? Or?
Yeah, Dan Gilbert talks a bit about that in Stumbling on Happiness, and I think, and I say a little bit about it in the book, maybe since writing it I've become a little more reflective on that observation, because you really want to be, it's really critical that you ask the right people, and it's critical that you ask people that are going to pay attention to your experiences, because they might be massive storytellers as well.
Yeah.
And so they're just going to overlay the stories that you tell with another set of stories, and that can get in the way. So I think it's about paying attention to relevant experiences of others. In one study, there was a study on women's dating preferences, where they were showing the men that they could date, and they were asking them, you know, which ones they'd like to go on dates with, and other women's experiences on those dates were much more accurate representations of how they felt on the date than they thought how they would feel. So of course there are examples where paying attention to the experiences, maybe many other people might help.
Yeah. Okay, well, just kind of before we throw it open to everyone, I mean, as you said yourself, there's been an explosion in happiness research really over the last kind of 10 years or more, really. So where do you think the whole field is going now? I mean, what are the big questions we need to think about as happiness researchers, or where's the whole field going to go, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to increasingly inform policy decisions. I have no doubt about that. And I think maybe I don't know. I obviously would be arguing as we do that we get much more data on experiences of pleasure and purpose, and especially purpose. There are only a couple of data sets that we look at in the book that have experiences of purpose. And so we need to understand much more about that, particularly for workplaces. And then I think the next challenge will be, can we find out how happy people are without asking them?
Right.
See, at the moment, I don't think there's a better way
of
finding out how angry you are, stressed you are, than asking you. But maybe from physiological markers, psychological indicators, observations of people's behaviour, a whole range of other ways that maybe in 2 decades' time we're getting some corroboration for the self-reports. Because I think that's quite interesting. Come back to your first question about the subjectivity of these assessments. One of the great sales pitches for brain scanning is that it shows correlations. Well, of course you would expect it to, because you'd expect happy people to have happy bits of their brain light up. That's kind of obvious, but it's very useful to get these measures taken seriously. So I think that's where we're going to be moving. Okay,
fascinating. Well, certainly a brave new world. Well, thanks very much, Paul.
That was not a brave new world like Aldous Huxley.
Hopefully not. Exactly. Well, that was fascinating. I think now if we open it to general questions, and just a request is, we are making a podcast of this, so if you want to ask a question, if you could just wait for the microphone to come to you, and maybe just give your name and affiliation for your question. So there's one guy in the middle there with the green, so you get the microphone is just on its way there.
The hardest person to reach in the whole auditorium.
Hello, I'm Frank Venmans. I wanted to ask you, how do you measure purposefulness?
Yeah.
And I read this book of Sedelsky, and they make a critique on happiness economics, saying that whether your results are obviously true and then you don't gain any extra insight, or your results is against what you intuitively would think, and then you throw away the results. So I think it's related with the difficulty of measuring purposefulness.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. And I realise in my kind of whistle-stop tour, I suppose, through the introduction, that I didn't make clear how we might do that. We do it by asking people questions about how worthwhile, how meaningful, how fulfilling, how purposeful the activities that they engage in feel. So in that sense, it's exactly how you would ask a question about pleasure and pain. So it places them both on that experiential footing. And unlike Skidelsky and others, I don't want to make claims about what good lives look like. I find that sits very uncomfortably with me, to make a judgment about what I think people ought to be doing in order to be experiencing purpose. I'd like them to work that out for themselves. And as I say, some things that I might find purposeful, you might not, and that seems entirely reasonable to me. As long as you're not causing harm to other people, knock yourself out.
Any other questions? You have this one here.
Rob Metcalf, University of Chicago. Can you talk a bit more about how you would use pleasure and purpose to make markets more efficient? So obviously using people's preferences, we can think about willingness to pay, increase in consumer surplus, producer surplus. So I'm just thinking about how can firms use pleasure and purpose to make markets more efficient?
So Rob is acknowledged in the book quite favourably and appears at many points, and has now just asked me a really seriously challenging question to be an absolute arse. Efficient markets. Jesus, that makes me sound like I'm an economist. I think I was once back in the day. Efficient markets. What do they look like? Well, when we're eliciting, let me talk first about the challenges of eliciting preferences, because as you will know, as anyone else will, they're not particularly good guides to subsequent experiences. It's what drew me away in all of the health work that I did to begin with, away from asking people questions, willingness to pay type questions, to look more directly at experiences. So clearly there's a market failure, did I say that right? In using measures that are not useful representations of what I think ultimately counts, which is people's experiences. So clearly what we're doing is probably not the right thing. How would you then capture the experiences of individual pleasure and purpose aggregated up into a market to know whether you're optimizing or not? That should be in the next book. You should probably write that. At the moment, see what I've done, as long as it doesn't sell as many as mine, it'll be fine. What I've done at the moment, I think, is try to make a compelling case for the separation of those sets of experiences. I think the next and obvious question is to think about how you might combine them and aggregate them into an overall maximand. I don't know at the moment how to do that. And of course, you're the next generation. You can think of ways to do that. You bastard.
There's a question right up at the top there, and then one next. So this one first, and then up here. So no, this one first over here. There's a lady in the middle there.
When the music stops.
Hello, my name's Christine. I'm just wondering, happiness right now is a hot topic, this mindfulness movement, like everybody's really focused on, how to become happier. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, is there kind of some group effects of happiness? Are we in this culture of unhappiness that's resulting in all these people really looking for it? And if you think that's the case, like what do you think is creating that?
Creating what particularly? A culture?
Like a culture of unhappiness. Like I think about this topic as well, and sometimes I look around and I notice, in certain social situations, a lot of people like to talk about the negative more than the positive, and it's kind of like a cultural thing. You say something happy, people don't really know how to respond. You say something is really bad, you get a lot of conversation. So in thinking about it, I'm like, is there a culture of unhappiness that's creating this you know, everybody's kind of focusing more on the negative, and now people are looking, how do I become happier?
Do you think that we're doing that more now than we did in the past?
Well, I don't know about the past. Like, from right now, it's just a thought I had, and I guess I'm wondering, like, what do you think about kind of this group level effect of happiness?
Of all, the first order answer to that question is actually most people are quite happy most of the time. We spend a predominance of our time in positive affective states, notwithstanding certain population groups. But most people in the generally healthy population feel all right. So it's not much of a problem in one sense. But clearly there are contagion effects, and misery loves company. And misery is much more contagious. If you're around someone who's feeling down, it's much easier to be brought down by them than for you to bring them up. So we then need to think of ways in which we can make the contagion of positivity more likely. It's interesting, many of you would have seen the Facebook experiment that they got in trouble for manipulating people's moods on Facebook. There's two things going on in Facebook there. One is when people are posting positive, Facebook stories. Evidently, I've never used it, but that there's a contagion of positivity, but also you feel like your life is miserable relative to all these people who are out having a great time. So there's always going to be there's always interesting contagion effects. There's going to be, on the one hand and on the other hand. And so I think part of the thing that policymakers can do, maybe, is to think about how they can encourage particular types of social capital, the glue that holds us together, in ways where those chains, the glue, is kind of happiness-making rather than misery-making.
Interesting, yeah. There's a question up in the corner here, yes, gentlemen?
Oh, hi. I was just wondering, are there any particular individual therapeutic implications of the work you've done, and what would you take away for it for people who are either working in therapeutic environments or in therapy themselves?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I'm going to, nearly all of the lines I've used have been my own. I'm going to use one of Laura's, which is putting the B back into CBT. Because most of CBT is cognitive therapy. And it's a reorientation of conscious attention. There's not much behavioural work in there. And I think that's where I think we might be moving, is to think about how we can think about designing environments, organising our lives in ways that draw our attention towards things that make us feel good without having to consciously, cognitively think about doing so.
And if I can just comment there
yeah,
as well.
No, of course
I think it is very interesting that when research has compared cognitive therapy with cognitive behavioural therapy, the cognitive behavioural is much more effective. So when people do behavioural exercises, that's actually much more effective than just the cognitive. So yeah, I think there's one lady just here in the corner.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
Hello.
I'm interested in the gap between people's experiences and their story. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, is there any benefit in focusing more so on a really positive story, even if it's not realistic for you at all? Maybe if you're stuck in a certain situation, you can't change your experiences. Should you just focus on this unrealistic story that you're telling, or should you just admit to yourself that the story's not real?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I've kind of, for the sake of argument and discussion, I've kind of been very dismissive of the narratives and the stories, as if they always get in the way of being happier. That's clearly not true. And there will be, I haven't mentioned the words context matters yet. I nearly always, every talk I give, those two words come out of my mouth at some point, and they just have. Context matters. And so there clearly will be environments and circumstances and situations where paying attention to the good stories might make you feel better than the bad experiences. What else do I want to say about that? I mean, there's a balance to be struck. We need to delude ourselves, all of us do, right? We don't really want to know what people really think of us. It's advantageous to be a little bit optimistic, to think of yourself as a bit more attractive, a bit clever, a bit funnier than you really are. But not too much so, because then you're a bit of an arse. And so, knowing where you get that balance right, that's pretty tricky. But there is a balance to be struck with, a little bit of delusion and storytelling, but not too much.
Okay, Sam, yeah, there's one up there.
Hi. My question was about what we mentioned about the purposefulness. And don't you think that people are unhappy because they focus too much on having purpose, and they think, I must have purpose, so I feel happy, and because they can't find a purpose, they make themselves unhappy. And you think, like Albert Camus in Myth of Sisyphus just sort of says, if you don't have the purpose, then you can be happy if you realize life is meaningless, but actually you can enjoy it. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think maybe it comes to the distinction I'm making between purpose as an evaluation and as an experience. So, you can find, I find going to the gym a purposeful experience. You might hate that. You might like gardening, volunteering. These are all things that show up as relatively purposeful experiences, particularly helping others. But as an experience, and I think that happy lives do, is kind of to restate the point, that happy lives contain experiences of both things that you find fun on the one hand and fulfilling on the other. But they are located in the experiences, not that life has a purpose. Jesus, that made me pretty miserable thinking about whether my life has purpose. I think that probably would make you depressed if you thought about that, because most of what we do is pretty stupid, actually. If you think about it hard enough and long enough, most of it is pretty stupid. So I don't want to be spending too long thinking about how meaningful my life is. I want to be thinking how meaningful the activities and the moments that I have are.
Okay, there's one at the back there, the lady at the back.
Hello, my name is Sarah. I was wondering, how would you best link behavioral economics and health policy, especially value-based healthcare? And also,
sorry, can you say that again?
How would
that won't come as a surprise to you. It's not. It was the microphone, not you.
Right. No. How would you best link behavioral economics link behavioral economics and value-based healthcare in the future, such as like health policy, adaptation, and health states? And also, where do you see yourself going in the future? Are you going to more positive psychology research, or are you going to go back to healthcare, because you've written a lot of papers about both?
I've written a lot of papers.
Yeah.
A quick story that what initially drew me to thinking about happiness measures was problems with the way that we value health states in public policy. And it's an attentional problem. When you ask people hypothetical questions about their willingness to give up life years to being in or out of certain conditions, you find that on average people think that having some problems walking about is as bad as having anxiety or depression, moderate anxiety. And so institutions like NICE are allocating scarce healthcare monies on the basis of that assumption. You only have to think about that for a second to realise that that's actually not true. It's true initially. Yeah, of course, if you have some problems walking about to begin with, it draws attention to itself. But you quickly get used to it. In a way, with anxiety and depression, you don't. There's no adaptation to feeling depressed. And so what that led me to do is thinking, have we got more direct ways of assessing the impact of healthcare interventions, more direct assessments of the impact on people's lives than these hypothetical questions? The behavioural economics thing, I guess, is a slightly maybe different question, is when thinking about policy making, we need to think about how policy makers use system 1 processes as well as system 2 logic and thought. Because I think we sometimes think that whilst all these individuals out there are using these system 1 reptilian responses to things, somehow policy makers are doing something different and they're logical, rational and Mr. Spotlight. But system 1 is always present, always active and always engaged. And so policy decisions will be made affected by automatic and unconscious and emotional processes in every bit as much as individual decisions are. So I think understanding